Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar, Shingo Model Basics. I'm Dominic Bria. I've been with the Shingo Institute for about 3.5 years now. With me in the room is Sean Barker, who's the Assistant Director here at the Shingo Institute, and also the Assessments Director of the teams that go out and assess organizations for the Shingo Prize. And also we have Tom Davis, who will be monitoring and managing the questions that you ask. And I want to draw your attention to the lower right side of your screen where you can type in questions at any time uh, during the webinar. I will tell you, though, that we've had a huge response to this webinar, and it is unlikely that we'll get to everyone's questions. So please do ask the questions. If we don't get to yours, we will have the email addresses, both Sean's email address and mine, and you can email us later. Also, we will send everyone, all registrants, post-webinar email with the recording. We're recording the webinar, and we'll send you the link to the webinar, and you can simply respond to that email if you like with questions that you have that didn't get answered. And we have a system in place whereby those will come back to us. Before we move on, I just wanted to draw your attention very quickly to these two summits that we have coming up. One focused specifically on manufacturing organizations. That's happening in near Dallas in September, and the other is on services companies, and that includes insurance organizations and healthcare. That's happening in Chicago in October. We've got about an hour to discuss things here, and that's not very much time. So we want to encourage you to come to these types of events to broaden your knowledge of the Shingo model. So to begin with, I want to give you a basic idea of where the Shingo model came from, why it's important, why it's a good thing to pay attention to. Of course, it began with the people, including Shigeo Shingo, who crafted what is known today as the Toyota production system. That happened over decades. That was created, and by the late 1980s, it was very clear that was radical thinking in manufacturing. That's where it began, of course, was in manufacturing. And so at that time, in 1988, some folks here at Utah State University got together with Dr. Shingo, awarded him an honorary doctoral degree, and decided to come up with a way to recognize organizations that were able to create and sustain excellence wherever they were in all the world. And so that's where, of course, Dr. Shingo had by then published 17 books. I think 8 or 9 of them, wasn't it, translated to English? 7 of them were translated to English. And so that's where the Shingo Prize came from. Is they decided that was how we should recognize organizations of excellence. And then, of course, to administer that prize, and of course, the natural outgrowth of that was as we learned things in assessing organizations and awarding the Shingo Prize, people wanted to know what we had learned. And so that's where the Shingo Institute came from. So some interesting things came out of that. So we've been doing that for about 30 years now, assessing organizations for the Shingo Prize. And as you can imagine, we've learned some interesting things. But as we were looking at organizations and going back and revisiting them, as they were on their lean journey and their continuous improvement journeys, what we found very often was companies would do really well for a while, and then when we go back a couple of years to look at them again, they had suffered a decline. And so we began to focus on what was the difference between companies who were able to sustain that and companies who weren't, companies who were able to sustain cultures of excellence, and companies that weren't. And so we began to form what eventually became the Shingo model. So we understood that systems had to use tools in order to get results, and we understood that culture was very essential to it all. But we also knew that wasn't quite complete, and so we kept examining and researching. We came up with 3 insights of enterprise excellence, and this became critical to completing what we know today as the Shingo model. And I just want to talk through some of these, and so that you can understand how those fit in. The first is that ideal results require ideal behaviors, and you're going to hear me repeat that term, ideal behaviors, repeatedly today. Of course, ideal behaviors are the ones that are going to that are most likely to get the organization to where it wants to be with it, and hopefully that means that you're flowing value to customers. And in order to get to that point, the associates, all of the associates in a company, have to be exhibiting ideal behaviors. The second one is that systems drive those behaviors. So that means in order for us to reach the goals of the organization and have the ideal behaviors to do that, we have to put into place systems that will elicit the behaviors that we need. So systems drive behaviors. And then this third one became critical to completing the Shingo model. And this is what it is. Principles inform ideal behaviors. Principles are the things that help to determine what an ideal behavior is. And so with those in mind, we came up with this. And so when most people think of the Shingo model, this is what they picture. And so let me just talk through a little bit of this with you. If you can see, let me turn on my little pointer here. You remember that third one at that third guiding principle. Principles inform ideal behaviors, and so that's where we put principles at the top of this little formation here. One thing I want you to notice is that results and culture are the same color, and that is to denote the fact that we've found that results and culture are absolutely inseparable. How the culture goes, that's how the results go. I also want to show you, so the general way this works together is that the principles align the systems that you use to get the behaviors that you need. The systems select the tools that you'll use to achieve the results that you want, and that's generally how it works. But I also want to draw your attention to these little arrows at the corners of some of the diamonds, and that is to denote the fact that each of these has its own impact on the culture of an organization. And when we talk about the culture, here in this case, we're talking about the collective behaviors of everyone who's in the organization. That's what we're talking about there. So what we're saying here is that principles, good or bad, if you don't deliberately put certain guiding principles in place, something will be there. Something will be there, and that is what will align. That will impact your culture. So, if you have a culture that rewards firefighters, people who can deal well with emergencies, if that becomes your culture, or those are the principles that you have in place. That's going to shape the kind of culture that you have at your organization. So this is on the right. This on the left. This is what most people think of when we talk about the Shingo model. But The Shingo, I want you to think of the Shingo model as having two parts. The part on the left is descriptive. We're saying that any medium or large organization is going to interact that way. It's going to have all those parts, and that's how they interact. For better or worse, that's how they're going to interact. But it also has, the Shingo model also has a prescriptive section, and that's what I want you to look at on the right here. This is the prescriptive section, the 10 guiding principles. And I'm going to go through those with you, but I want you to understand that we're calling the 10 guiding principles, and that means that they go right here. So let me just talk a little bit about this pyramid, the 10 guiding principles. Turn off the arrow here. So notice first that it's divided into 4 different dimensions. They're sort of configured in a pyramid shape. The base of the pyramid is what we call cultural enablers, which means that none of the rest of these principles really can work very well unless those cultural enablers are in place. The next dimension above that is continuous improvement. There are 5 principles within the dimension of continuous improvement. Above that is the enterprise alignment dimension, and that has to do with how the systems and tools align to reach that top dimension, which is results. And results is at the top because none of this matters if we can't get the results that we need. So let's work through some of these. I can't spend a whole lot of time on some of these, but I want to at least give you a basic idea of this. That in order to get more details of this, I encourage you to if you have a Shingo model booklet already, that's great. If you don't, it's a free download. If you go to the shingo.org and click on the Shingo model button at the top of the screen, you can get that emailed to you for free. There's also a Discover Excellence book that you can purchase that goes a bit deeper into it. And then, of course, we have the Shingo model workshops. But we're going to go through just the basics of each one of these today. So we'll start at the very bottom. and at the very bottom is respect to every individual. And this has to do with the fact that organizations need to structure themselves to value every individual and to nurture their potential. Dr. William Kahn was a researcher who did a lot of research in the early 1990s on employee engagement. And he was the one who first talked about bringing your best self to work, the best version of yourself to work. And critical to that is being able to feel that you are respected every day at work. And so, feeling respected, when people notice how their coworkers are being treated and assume that they will be treated the same way, and so that heavily affects the culture of an organization. The next one up is lead with humility, and that can also be described as lead with curiosity, and it means that a leader will have to be willing to change when he or she learns something new. And that means in order to do that, you have to trust other people with decision-making abilities. You have to trust your subordinates with decision-making abilities. It's very tempting for experienced leaders and managers to assume that they know the best way to do the job. And in some cases, that may be true. But it's also important to have the humility to be able to step back and let workers do the work the way they think it should be done whenever possible. Now, let me be clear here. We're not saying that you're never going to have to redirect. You're never going to have to correct employees. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is when it's possible to give them decision-making latitude, it is highly optimal to the culture if you can do that. What am I missing there, Sean?
Well, and so don't, please, this is Sean and good morning. So don't mistake this for not needing standard work. Standard work is critical, but their ability to engage in the development of standard work is also critical. Remember, standard work is highly needed, especially when we talk about the scientific method. So,
Excellent. So the next dimension, of course, is the continuous improvement principle. And again, there are 5 of them. The seek perfection, the principle of seek perfection or pursue perfection. Some people bristle at that. Some people remind us that when Dr. Shingo and Taiichi Ono first introduced this principle back in the 60s or 70s, it was truly radical. Perfection in manufacturing, that's just not a thing. And so it was quite radical. So we've left it as seek perfection, but it's really about the positive motivation. It should be used as a weapon to beat associates over the head with. It's about positive motivation. How can we make it better? What's the next breakthrough, however small? That has to be the continual attitude for seek perfection. Above that is assure quality at the source. And that's just all about, you don't pass poor quality forward. If there's a problem, you stop the line and you fix the process that produced the defect in the first place right away. That's pretty simple. It's fairly basic to lean. And so that's the basic of assure quality at the source. Above that is flow and pull value. Now, a lot of people confuse this one because it sounds like a noun, flow and pull value. This is actually a directive. What we're saying is that we need to flow and pull value, and so the value for customers is maximized when it's created in response to a real demand, a continuous and uninterrupted flow. This is all about one piece flow. And waste, as you go through and look for waste, it's anything that disrupts that continuous flow of value. That's the basics of flow and pull value. That's a complex concept, and there's a lot more to talk about that we're not going to cover here today. Is there any point that I need to make on that? We're good there. Okay. The next one, of course, is embrace scientific thinking. And this one, the basis of this one is standard work. In order to approach things from a scientific standpoint, you have to first have a baseline, a benchmark from which to work. So this is the best way we know how to get this process done. Now, once you have that established, then it's, in order to embrace scientific thinking, what you're doing is finding ways to improve it and proving that it really is an improvement. Does this make it so that we can do something faster? Does it make it easier for our employees? Does it flow more value to our customers? Those are the things that any of those things and others that can improve. But the idea is to go about it from a scientific standpoint, and improve it by proving that it really is that a new process really is better, and not just that someone happens to like it better. The next one is focus on process, and this one kind of has 2 different parts to it. The first of it is to focus on process. In other words, much like scientific thinking, we're focusing on how to improve our process. But the other part of focus on process that's critical is focusing on the process instead of focusing on what someone did wrong. So when something goes wrong, we have a defect in our product, or we have a defect in our service, the tendency very often is to look for who's to blame, who's screwed up, whose fault is it? and really to focus on process, what we're trying to find is how was it that it was easier for this person to do the wrong thing than it was to do the right thing, and then how do we reverse that? And that's what we mean by focus on process. The next dimension, of course, is enterprise alignment. And as I said, these principles have to do with how we're aligning all of the systems and the tools in our organization together, so that they work together. Think systemically, that has to do with the relationships and interconnectedness within and between systems. And so to make sure that they're all aligned and working toward the same goal, and the same goal is the purpose for which they're designed. And of course, that leads us to the next principle, which is create constancy of purpose, or unity of purpose, it could be described as. And that's an unwavering clarity of why the organization exists. Where is it going? How is it going to get there? How do we bring value to our customers? That needs to be the focus. How to bring value to customers. Because if we're not bringing value to customers, really nothing else matters. We don't continue to exist very long as an organization. And that, of course, is why the results is at the top of the pyramid, creating value for customers. Because without that, none of the rest matters. Value, and the value that we're talking about has to be defined by what our customer wants. What was our customer define as value? And if we can't do that, then we really can't sustain our organization over the long run. So those are the 10 guiding principles. And again, let me reiterate that what we're saying is that the Shingo model, this is the descriptive side of the Shingo model, and this again is the prescriptive side. There's 10 guiding principles, and what we're saying is these 10 guiding principles, over our 30 years of examining companies, we found that these are the 10 principles that are best placed into this top diamond of guiding principles. Again, something's going to be there unless you act quite deliberately to make sure that the guiding principles at your organization are these or similar ones. You have to be very deliberate about making those happen. And so that's how all of this works together. So that is the Shingo model. That's the basics of the Shingo model. So I also want to describe this, or talk a little bit about this little graphic. Most people, most leaders and managers have to pay attention to key KPIs, key performance indicators. We've all heard of those. And those are the tools that produce the results. Those are the lagging indicators. What we like to focus on, or we recommend organizations also focus on, is the KBIs, the key behavioral indicators. And those are formed by the principles that determine the systems that we put in place to elicit the behaviors, the ideal behaviors that we want to see from all of the associates of the organizations. Those are leading indicators. And so just want you to be aware of the difference. The leading indicators, the lagging indicators of KPIs that we've all heard of, but also the leading indicators, the key behavioral indicators that tell us if the behaviors are in place for the results that we want. What am I missing there, Sean?
Well, I think the critical part of looking at the model is, if we go back one slide, is looking at the piece that I'm looking over to the model where guiding principles are up on top on the I guess it'd be your left side of the pyramid. And when you look at this, this articulates how these components of the model work together. So when you look at guiding principles, well, the only way those actually manifest themselves are in behaviors, right? So when we talk about systems that drive behaviors and being aligned to principles, we're talking about systems where the behavior that we are driving is aligned to the principle that we are trying to impact. So for an example of that, if we're looking at respect every individual, and we're looking to drive that into the process, perhaps we're looking at a system of how do we engage people. So we're looking at part of our system of problem solving where we get ideas. We have an idea generation system. So when we look at that idea generation system, we're looking at the specific behaviors that come out of that to make sure that we are driving those toward ideal behavior. So now the question becomes, well, how do we make sure we know what the ideal behavior is, right? So we need to investigate each principle, and this is what we actually do in our workshops, is we investigate to get down to the ideal behaviors to make sure that we are heading in the correct direction, right? So that's a lot of the work that we do in the workshop. So in this example, we want everybody engaged with ideas or creating ideas at the appropriate level, right? Leaders, managers, and associates are going to have different appropriateness for the types of suggestions that they're going to give, but we want them heavily aligned with the objectives of the organization, with those goals and objectives that we have put out and that we have deployed through the organization. We want to make sure that there's a deep understanding of if it's waste that we're attacking, that what that type of waste is. And we can tell that by the suggestions that we get in, by the problems that are being worked on, and by the activities that are actually going on within the organization. So by understanding these behaviors, it also gives us the ability to predict, as you heard Dom say, you know, some of these are leading indicators for some of the things that are going on in our organization. So you gain the ability to be able to predict the outcomes that you're going to have in your organization. That's where the results side, and that's why results and culture are so heavily tied together, because they impact each other quite directly. So these are the things that we're talking about when you look at the articulation of how these work together in the model. And obviously we could go on with many discussions about this. So when you're looking at key behavioral indicators, it's no different than when you look at your KPIs, right? You do this in most cases naturally. When you go into work every day, you're looking at specific things in your organization that indicate to you what the outcome is going to look like for that month, for that quarter, for that year, whatever the case might be. None of us go into work and at the end of the month go, gee, I wonder what happened, right? It doesn't happen that way. We have indicators that tell us about where things are going to come out. It's no different on the behavioral side. When we're looking at those behavioral indicators of the things that are actually going on down in the organization, that people are actually doing, some of those that we choose are good indicators, others aren't. That's why we talk about key behavioral indicators, because there's a lot of behavior going on. We want to know specifically which ones are most tied to those results that we're going to get. No different than when you're looking at results, you want to know which types of results that are happening further down in the organization are most tied to those KPIs that you're going to look at each month or quarter, or whatever the case might be. So it's the same type of process. And if we go on to the next graphic that Dom was talking about, this is kind of where it all comes together for us. And we talk about how that gap between what we might currently be doing, and in many cases, the focus on results and tools is enormous in organization because we have to focus on results. All of us have to get results. So I don't want to take away necessarily from that focus on results, but I want to add the focus on principles and behaviors that are actually going on in our organization, because that's what sustains our results. And by sustaining results, I mean that's what makes it easier for our organization to be flexible in achieving those results, to be adaptive to those things that are going on in our environment so that we can change quickly and keep our results heading in the correct direction. And what accomplishes that are the systems that you see right in the middle of the bridge. That's what closes the gap. Our focus on designing systems to make the right thing the easier thing to do, to lead us closer toward that ideal behavior and those ideal results, is always the way we want to continually evolve those systems and design those systems when we're thinking about how we're going to align that with principles. So systems is what fills the gap between having just a focus on results and working really hard on that, constantly having to push those. And I know many of us are familiar with the many things that we've seen over our careers that have come and gone, have delivered results, and then maybe somebody's left the organization, or the focus on whatever that program was is no longer the focus, and we move on to another program to try and get those results moving in the correct direction again, right? What we're talking about by developing the right systems is the ability to not constantly change what the program is, to embed this into what you currently do. If there's anything you leave with from this webinar today, please understand that the Shingo model is not another program for you to head on. What it is it's something to strengthen what you currently have and to guide it in this direction of building the systems that will get you to the operational excellence that you all see.
So we can see that there are some questions coming up. One of them is, and this is one that's quite common. Examples. What are some of the examples of these behaviors? I assume by these behaviors we mean ideal behaviors, and that can vary depending on what the system it is that you're working on. For example, let's say that you're working on a suggestion system. Of course, the ideal behavior there is to have people giving you suggestions, and the way that you shape that system. So, for example, I saw an organization that for every improvement suggestion that was put in, your name went in a hat, and it was a raffle for a really great prize every month. And so that was a system that went into place to affect that ideal, to elicit that ideal behaviors of putting in suggestions for improvements, because those suggestions ought to be coming from frontline associates. Another example might be a safety system. You know, if an associate comes to an aisle in a warehouse and doesn't look both ways before crossing and could get run over by a forklift, we need to have in place there is a system, maybe a training system, or it may be a visual management tool that reminds people. But what we do is put into place systems and tools that elicit the ideal behavior of looking both ways before you cross an aisle. What are some other ones, Sean?
Yeah, so let's broaden that just a little bit more, right? Because as leaders and managers and as we're working down there, we don't always have the time to see and wait long enough to see all the behaviors that are happening. So one of the things we talk about is, so how do you see the evidence of that? And let me give you an example of that. Let's just talk about problem solving for a moment, right? If we go down and we look at problem solving, and this is of course one of the things we do a lot on assessments, right? We go down, we look at how people are problem solving, right? So if you were just to walk up to one of the tools that's commonly used, a visual board that starts to list problems, and then you start to ask the right questions about those problems, right? You start to look for the evidence that we're getting to root cause. Well, if I start looking weeks back, or if I start asking the person that's filling out the board, well, so I see there's a problem here. Well, how often does that problem come up? And their response to me is, oh, this problem comes up all the time. We're constantly working on this. We never don't have this on our board. It's at least once a week. Well, that begins to tell me something, right? So then the question becomes, how are we tackling that? What is the behavior that is in place that begins to tackle that problem? So just by going through that short process, I can begin to understand how we get down to being able to deal with root causes in whatever the facility might be that you're looking at. So understanding what the behavior ought to be and what ideal is. Remember that we're always going to see some version of ideal. We normally won't see actual ideal behavior happening, right? Where we want every time that there's a problem coming up, we want everybody swarming to solve that problem. We want it working through a structured problem solving process like PDCA, right, or DMAIC or something like that, where that always happens every single time, right? Ideally, that's what we want to happen, but we usually see some version of that. So when that's why it's critical to get the right key behavioral indicators, because there are so many. So what are the ones that we can look at in this case in problem solving to tell us if our problem solving system is working and evolving in the direction that we want it to get us to those ideal behaviors, down to the root cause, solving problems each time that they pop up with the intent of not having them come up again. So those are just a few examples. I mean, obviously we could go on with this, but I want to address the next question because it's a really good one on how do we change bad behaviors. Because obviously when we're looking at building systems to drive people toward the good behaviors, we're going to have a lot of those in place. And interestingly enough, if you go online and you download our guidelines, you'll find a couple of tools there, and one of them is the behavioral assessment scale. And if you look at this behavioral assessment scale, and it talks about frequency, intensity, duration, scope, and role of the behavior that's happening. And it tells you how mature a behavior is in an organization by looking at each one or through each one of these lenses. Interestingly enough, it doesn't only tell you how embedded a good behavior is, it tells you how embedded a bad behavior is. And by knowing how embedded a bad behavior is, or a behavior, let's not say bad behavior, but let's say a behavior you don't want, that tells you how much energy and resources you're going to need to use to eliminate that, which in some cases is quite a lot to do that. So in looking at the system that you have and that you want to build, one of the key things that makes a system work is if it doesn't make my job better, easier, right, to do, or doesn't make the output that I'm doing better, I can't see that. Well, this is the whole reason I want to do it, right? That's the whole reason that I would want to change to enable me to do my job better. Now, of course, we feel that everybody wants to do their job the best they possibly can and produce the output that is being expected of them. I mean, that's, I think, one of the number one assumptions that we go with. Our ability as leaders and managers to build those systems to enable people to do that is why people will change to do that. Yeah, it's not always a fast process, and And as you all know, you've all been working at this a long time, right? It takes a long time to shift a culture in an organization. But, it's always to the benefit of the folks that are working within the organization, because it does make their jobs easier to accomplish, easier to do, and therefore the results are better at the end of the day. So it's a great question, because we do have to eliminate those behaviors that we do not want in the organization as well. So I'm glad you brought that up in this discussion.
So there's another question here, Sean, that I think goes along with this, and this is from Camilla, and she says, "How do you keep track of KBIs? What are some examples of tools you can use to keep track of KBIs?"
Yeah, that's an important question, right? Most of us have dashboards that we use out there, and this is the place to begin to keep track of those, right? We have to keep track of them. Not only do we have to keep track of them, we have to learn how to assess them, so that we know that we're going the right direction, because we're never going to take an organization from where we are today, what our current state is, to the ideal state. That's not the jump, right? The jump is all of these steps in between. So we have to know where our organization is culturally, meaning what is their capacity right now for certain things, right? What are their capabilities and their capacity right now? Because that begins to dictate what I can bring into the organization as part of the new system that I'm trying to develop, or the current system that you're trying to do, right? That you're trying to tweak in the direction that you want to go. I have to make sure that the capacity and the capability of the organization is there to enable what I'm putting in place to move forward. So dashboards are some of the ways that people look at those. And again, keep in mind that, even if you have your dashboard, your balance scorecard, whatever the strategy sheet is that you're looking, I've even seen X matrices that can include these type of things. There's only so many that can be tracked, no different than measures. I worked for an organization one time, we tracked everything, right? But it really comes down to what are the key measures, i.e. KPIs, right? The key measures that we're going to track. Same is true on the behavioral side. What are the key measures? Because you can quickly get inundated with so many behaviors that you could track, right? But you need to narrow those down. So people put them and they integrate them into their dashboards and their balanced scorecards, and these type of things, because they, at the end of the day, they should be tied to those measures that you're trying to drive. So that's a good place to do it. That's a great question.
Yeah. And what are this Victor asks, what are the most common and basic behaviors that ought to be generated? What are some? I think he's asking for some other examples here. What do you see as in assessments?
Well, we could go on with examples probably all day, and that's actually what we do in our workshops for days on end, because each time you're talking about a principle, we're really talking about the behaviors, right? So if you're looking at, Dom brought up seek perfection, right? If we're looking at seek perfection, right, what are some of the behaviors that we're going to see in place? Well, sometimes it's easier to look at those behaviors by looking at what is not the correct kind of behavior, right? So if we're after seek perfection, and you look at the organization, and again, what is ideal? And remember, I'm always talking from the ideal state, right? So what we're looking for is everybody that is working on improvement every day, everywhere, right? And I think that's how Masaki Amai addresses it, right? Everyone, everywhere, every day, right? So if that's what we're looking for ideally, and we go into an organization and you look in the organization and you go, and you start talking to people and they go, yeah, well, we were working on lean over here, but we've already leaned out that area, so we're now over here. Well, what does that tell you? Is that everyone, everywhere, every day? No, it's more of an event based, right? And it's not about uh, good or bad. We look at it as maturity of the organization, right? It's just a maturity issue, right? Where we need to be doing it all the time. We need to be looking at getting better all the time, right? That's what Seek Perfection is about. Is we don't let perfection get in the way of getting better. We just continually get better. We continually keep chipping away toward perfection, right? So in the ideal state, you would see people working on those things every day, heavily aligned to the objectives and goals of the organization, and chipping away at those and understanding why what they are currently doing, and whether it's a problem or whether they're working on something proactively, right? Ideally, we want them working on things that are proactive because we're addressing the problems so they don't come back, right? Again, from the ideal state. So those are some of the types of behaviors that we're talking about. Uh, and like I say, we could go on with examples, because of course and there are some more, by the way, in the model handbook. So if you look at the model handbook, there's again some more examples of behaviors. Remember though that getting to that key behavioral indicator, the key behavior that is driving those results is the critical one to be tracking and looking at.
Great. This question about how do you measure KPIs, and this is back to Camilla's question. How do you measure them? Sometimes, in the case, I use the example of a suggestion system. Sometimes you simply look at the number and quality of suggestions for improvement that you're getting. Other times, and even more often, you really have to go look. You have to go and observe and understand what's happening. You have to go to Gemba to do that. And that's key for measuring KPIs.
It really is. And again, go back to what I talked about on the assessment scale. If you download that assessment scale, it will begin to give you an idea of how we measure them, right? Because we're talking about behaviors, so you can look for the evidence of, meaning things that are happening with some of the tools, whether the tools are in place, because you can see some of those artifacts around parts of your organization or around the organization in general. But to actually find out what's being done, Dom is exactly correct. You have to go down. You have to, as part of going down to where things are actually happening, or on the shop floor or Gemba, or however you address it in your organization, you've got to begin to ask those types of questions to get deep enough into understanding whether that behavior is really happening. So it takes some investigating on the parts of leaders and managers to go down and measure that. But then, as it's the behavior that you're looking for, in some cases, it's just a binary measurement, right? It's either happening or it's not, right? That's why the frequency, intensity, duration, scope, and role become important, because everybody may not be exhibiting it, but you may have some that are exhibiting it, right? Remember, ideally, you want everybody exhibiting the type of behavior that you're looking for. So measurement is, or assessment, that's how we term it, is a function of going down and understanding how it's actually happening, what people are actually doing, because what people are doing is the behavior.
Right. Somebody brought up the fact that behaviors are interpreted differently by different observers, and so how do you calibrate on KPIs? And I want to mention that there is a tool for that. It's called the Shingo Insight Assessment, and it's an online survey instrument where all or most of the employees at a facility take this survey, and so you can kind of see, and it asks them what they're seeing on specific the specific principles. And that's what the Shingo Insight Assessment is for. And you can find a link to that at shingo.org.
And that is important, right? Because you want everybody calibrated to exactly the key behaviors that they're looking for. Because again, there's lots of behaviors, right? But you're looking for those key behaviors that are going to provide that outcome. And this goes back to the question asked earlier about, you know, how do we track those KBIs? Because you want to be tracking those KBIs. You want everybody to understand exactly what those behaviors are that you're looking for, so that everybody has the same interpretation of what that behavior is when you're going down and looking for it and assessing for it in the organization. We're always working on how do you make that less and less subjective and more objective, right? And that's part of you know, what brought about the insight tool that Dom is talking about. So we actually break them down into what we call behavioral benchmarks, which are groupings of behaviors, which are larger groupings of behaviors that break down even further into the key behavioral indicators. So that's a really important part of making sure that, you know, when you're doing an assessment in your organization, you know, again, trying to keep the bias out of it, which is sometimes difficult, certainly has been in the organizations that I've been in, to be able to keep the bias out of an internal assessment and to keep it as objective as possible.
A lot of people are asking whether they can get copies of the slides, and we can certainly make those available. As the thing to do for that is, when we send the follow-up email, simply reply and ask for those slides. There's also a question that I wanted to address that we see all the time. We get asked this question all the time, and that is, how do I implement Shingo principles if leadership is not on board? And I've heard two answers to this, one of which I agree with heartily, and the other one I don't agree with at all. The first answer is that if your leaders aren't on board, then don't bother with it, because they have to be on board. I don't agree with that answer, and the reason why is because I've seen specific cases where a manager can simply start down that path. So start by 5S'ing all of the areas over which you're in charge, and then begin with standard work, standard documented work, and then begin to improve upon that work. And in cases that I've seen, that begins to spread, and that's when the leaders come on board. So that's the answer that I happen to agree with, is if you can't do it organization wide or facility wide, simply do it in your sphere of influence.
Yeah, I think this gets back to what I was talking about earlier, and to one of the other most brought up questions when certainly when I talk with folks during the week is they want to know, how do we influence leaders, right? Well, you influence leaders by getting results, right? Leaders, we all want results, and you have to have results, right? So what Dom is saying is certainly true by the areas that you influence, but I think what I said earlier is really key. This is not another program, right? How we built this model and articulated how these things work together right now in your organizations. You have results, you have a culture, you have systems, and you have tools that you're using. Now, you may not currently have the benefit of understanding how the behaviors around these principles close the gap, but you can certainly build that into them, right? So the question is, how do we make what you currently have stronger by understanding how this model works and how these things work together, right? Because I don't think any leadership is ever going to come say, golly, why are you improving so well? Everybody wants that. Everybody's after that. but they want it using what they are currently putting in place, and these can easily be woven into any systems, values, whatever the case is in your organization to be able to make those systems better. What I call it is it's a function of the approach that we use. If we go in and say we've got a new program, that looks totally different than just understanding how the model works, how these systems have to evolve, and going in and beginning to tweak these systems to get some successes in place so that you begin to understand how this starts to change the culture of the organization and embed those kind of behaviors in the organization that in actuality everybody wants those in the organization. It's just a long journey to get them into the organization. So certainly it can be started in any area of a facility, and we've seen that, oh my gosh, played over I don't even know how many times, hundreds and hundreds of times in organizations, where everybody may not be on board, but you can still begin to make inroads.
And one thing that helps with that is is really to be able to talk to the other people who are going through the same thing. How are you implementing this? That's one thing that's missing from these webinars. These webinars tend to be really well attended for us, but one thing that's missing is that you can't interact with each other and find out what each other is going through. And that's why we recommend you go to these workshops that we offer. You can see a schedule of those at shingo.org, a schedule of upcoming workshops. But also you can go to Shingo events like the two that you see on your screen. Those are just two examples of upcoming events. If you go to events.shingo.org, you can see all of them. And that includes the manufacturing summit and the services summit. It also includes study tours. There's one coming up to Ireland and one in December going to Japan. And that's where you can go to companies that we've specifically selected because they're implementing these principles really well. They're great examples of how this ought to happen. What does it look like when these ideal behaviors are being achieved? And that's what the study tours are all about. And one of the most important elements of all of this is being able to interact with each other and talk about what we're going through to make these things happen.
Yeah, and that's really the beauty of them is creating that network. Because there's a lot of great questions that have come up today, and creating that network of folks that you can begin to bounce these off of, not just the things that work, but what were the things that didn't work? Why didn't they work? Could they work in our organization where they maybe didn't in another organization? And I'm partly addressing this question from Rolando on how long does it take? Another question that's asked very commonly, and of course the answer is the tough one, right? Where it depends, because it depends on the current culture of the organization, right? It's no different than changing an individual's behavior, right? But then you have to magnify it out across an organization and the behaviors that are already in that organization. If an organization has a lot of behaviors that you need to remove from the organization, well, then it's going to take you longer. So understanding the reality of where you're currently at is critical to be able to move to the next step along the path, right? So understanding the capacity for change and the capabilities of your organization to change are just absolutely critical, because it begins to define where you can go next and how quickly you can shorten this path, right, to be able to change quicker as you move along this continuum, and as you gain capability and capacity, it will become easier and easier over time, and you'll be able to move faster. You'll be able to implement things faster because the organization becomes more capable of doing this. But in the beginning, of course, understanding where you're at is what the beginning really is.
Tom is just reminding me to announce the address for the Shingo Insight tool that we had talked about a little bit earlier. It's very simple. It's just shingo.org/insight. Well, we want to be respectful of everyone's time. We've reached our hour, but there are so many questions. I feel badly we haven't even been able to scratch the surface on some of these great questions. I do encourage you to please ask them via email. You can see Sean's address and my address on there. And again, you can also simply reply to the follow-up email that will be going out that will include the link to the recording of this webinar. And please do share the webinar with colleagues that may have interest in understanding the basics of the Shingo model. And with that, we'll close. Thanks everyone for attending today.
Thank you. It's great conversation as always, and thank you for your time.